From 1940 to 46, I was curate of King's Norton, Birmingham. In 1943, our son, Christopher, then aged 3, contracted measles, and I had to help keep him amused when not otherwise engaged. We had pretty well exhausted the entertainment value of the nursery rhymes we knew, but there was nevertheless one which never seemed to fail. Early in the morning, down at the station, all the little engines standing in a row. Along comes the engine driver, turns a little handle, puff, puff, chuff, chuff, off we go. The last line always resulted in a delighted chorus which had to be repeated over and over and over again. It is difficult, looking back over a lapse of some 40 years or so, to remember the exact sequence of events. But I think it was at this stage I drew and coloured with crayons a picture of some engines standing in a row facing us on parallel tracks. And that in order to fill up the blank expanse of their smokebox fronts, I put a face on each, smiling, cross, stern, laughing, and sad. For some reason, it was the sad face which caught Christopher's eye. Why is that engine sad, Daddy? Because he's old, and he hasn't been out for a long time. What's his name, Daddy? Edward? This was the first name that came into my head. Thus, by question and answer, the Cinderella-type story of Edward's Day Out took shape. The sad story of Henry grew from a rhyme in much the same way, and when, after constant repetition, the wordage of both stories had become fixed to Christopher's satisfaction, I wrote the authorised version in pencil on the back of some old circulars to help me remember them for future family use. Inevitably, another story about Edward was demanded. This time we had no rhyme to start us off, but in the best fairy tale tradition, Edward featured as a giant killer, giving his comeuppance to a big, bossy engine in his shed. His name, Gordon, was not entirely off the cuff. Down the road there lived a little boy with whom Christopher sometimes played. He was bigger than Gordon. He was bigger than Gordon? He was bigger than Christopher. And bossy too. His name, Gordon, was therefore a natural. In the story, Gordon boasts to Edward how indispensable he is as an express engine, only to find that the next train to which he has been rostered is a goods train. This proves to be too much for him, and he has to be assisted by Edward. This story, after many repetitions, was likewise approved and written down in pencil with illustrations. The pictures I drew for all three were crude, with stickmen and very elementary scenery, but I was careful with the 3 engines. Each had a different wheel arrangement and shape, so that Christopher could tell them apart easily. Gordon was a Gresley 462, one of his early ones, A1 later A3. Henry was a Robinson 442, from the former Great Central Railway. Edward was a somewhat nondescript 440. I placed no value on the stories except for family use, and laughed at my wife's suggestion that they were good enough to be published. She was as ignorant as I about how to set about getting them published, but she wouldn't give up, and wrote to my mother about them. My mother, who lived in Clapham, wrote back saying that a distant cousin of hers, who was, she thought, a literary agent now on his way through London, and had asked her for a bed for the night. If, she wrote, Wilbert would like me to show him the stories, send them at once. There was no time for fair copies, so we sent the pencil roughs. Michael must have had great imagination to see anything worthwhile in these scraps of paper. He showed them to various publishers, but with no success. Then, in 1944, he met Mr. Edmund Ward. Mr. Ward was, I understand, a fine art printer in Leicester. He was interested in children's books and was appalled at the lack of good quality literature available for children in the shops of those wartime utility days. He planned to redress this state of things by introducing about 5 titles with good, clear print, with bright pictures on the best art paper then available. When Michael met him, he had selected 4 titles and was looking for a 5th. He must have had considerable imagination too, to see a future in my scraps of paper. Anyway, he liked the stories and said that if I would write a 4th story, getting Henry out of his tunnel and producing a happy ending, he would publish. So I did just that, and the little book came out in May 1945. It is interesting to note that, probably with the aim of saving paper, he decided on the size and format still in use today. Here I must say that it was lucky for me that my first book appeared at this time. It is, or was, difficult to get into the children's book market. Parents and relatives naturally buy for their children... I'll try that again. Parents and relatives naturally buy for their children books which they enjoyed when they were young. Thus, established authors get the preference, and new, and therefore unknown authors are passed over. In my case, however, when in May in 1945 my little book appeared, there was a dearth of children's books, and people at first bought it because there was little else available. However, they seemed to like it, and it sold remarkably well. Mr. Ward wrote, "This book is selling so fast that it frightens me."
It begins.
Between May 1945 and March 1946, he had had to reprint it 4 times. Long before this, however, in 1943, I had made for Christopher a push-along model of Ed out of odds and ends of wood, together with 5 4-wheeled coaches. He wanted another engine, so, feeling unequal to tackling Gordon or Henry, I made a 6-wheeled tank engine, which we called Thomas. I also built some trucks and a brake van for him too. Inevitably, we had to have stories about Thomas. These were offered to Mr. Ward in 1945, and since the first book had been successful, there was no difficulty in getting the second accepted. But as the pages in the first book were so appalling, another artist, whose name I never knew, was engaged to draw the illustrations instead, and made a very good job of them. In the spring of 1946, I resigned my curacy at King's Norton to become rector of Ellsworth with Knapwell, Cambridgeshire. I had now to cope with a rundown parish and a tumble-down rectory, and in consequence had little leisure and certainly no time at first for writing. Things, however, began to ease in 1948. This was fortunate, for in January or February of that year, I had a telephone call from Mr. Ward asking for another book to be published that autumn. Though still hard-pressed, I was able to squeeze in the time to comply with Mr. Ward's request. He would, he said, give me £75 for it. This to me was marvellous. I couldn't get over my amazement that a publisher should actually ask me to write a book for him. There was no time to lose, as I could only spare 1 morning a week for the job. And what was it to be about? A little thought suggested that James, who had crashed into the last story of the Thomas book, would be of interest. His original black livery was dull, so we changed it to red, and James the Red Engine was born, and written at high speed. For that reason, James is the book I like least in the whole series. The stories have not the quality of those in the other books, and I always feel squirmy inside when I have to read them. They offend my sense of craftsmanship. There was, too, the problem of illustrations. I had hoped that the Thomas the Tank Engine artist would do them, but for some reason he was not available, and since I abominated the first artist's pictures, Mr. Ward suggested that I drew them myself. Here I could make shift to draw engines, but people and scenery were beyond me. Then a possible solution presented itself. We had recently appointed a new headmistress to Knapwell School, and sketching was one of her hobbies. Miss B knew nothing of railways, but agreed to draw people and landscapes if I would do the trains. So we set to work in a joint effort. The 30 pictures took us far longer to do than had been necessary for the stories. However, we were pleased with the results, and posted them off with a quick Alas, we had our comeuppance by return, when Eric Marriott, Mr. Ward's editor, thanked me for my rough pictures, and said they would engage an artist, Mr. C.R. to redraw them for publication. Eric Marriott subsequently became a great friend, but I must confess that my feelings towards him at that moment were far from friendly. Miss Bean and I didn't see Dolly's pictures till the book had come out, but when we did, we were both agreed that we much preferred our own. Though, to be fair, Mr. Dolby's pictures were far and away better than those which the first artist had perpetrated. After that, I gave up and concentrated in future books on the stories. But with book 5, Troublesome Engines, for which incidentally I got £100, I did win a concession from Mr. Ward. In addition to my description in words of the pictures I wanted for each page, Mr. Dolby was to send me his pencil drafts for comment, and also his colours. Some ground had thus been gained, but the game proved more theoretical than the real. Mr. Dolby was a very pleasant friend, but simply could not understand my request for consistency. To him, in common with many other people, one engine was much like another, and he was quite unconcerned in matters of detail. What does it matter? He asked me. These books will fade out in a few years. It isn't as though there's going to be a
Here we are, nearly 80 years later.
Nevertheless, inconsistencies in Dolby's pictures got me in trouble with sharp-eyed boys and girls who blamed me for the artist's mistakes which they pointed out with great glee. It was quite useless to tell them the truth. That, to a child of 3, 4, or 5, would have carried no weight at all. The child had seen Henry or Gordon or whoever in a particular picture and noted that he looked different in other pictures, perhaps in the same book. He had seen a picture of him like that. Therefore, to the child, it was so, and he or she was entitled to know why he looked different in that picture. Accordingly, in my replies, I had to make up stories to account for these discrepancies. There were very many of these, and as I had long ago decided that each letter deserved a personal answer, and this isn't from the lecture, but they were very personal, the answers, every one individual, life began to get a bit too short. After a while, I developed stock answers for the commonest questions, and this eased the pressure. Having said this, I must add that all the letters received were a delight. I learned much from them about the art of storytelling, and enjoyed exercising my ingenuity in devising suitable answers. For example, on page 9 of Tank Engine Thomas Again, there is a drawing of Henry, which has given rise to more indignant letters than any other. Here is an extract from a typical letter written on behalf of a puzzled 3-year-old.
Dear Rev. W. Awdry, it's Henry again. He goes from green to blue and then to green again. He won't come out in the rain, he rolls over in the snow, and now he's made me have a row with Daddy. In Tank Engine Thomas Again, Daddy came to page 8, and I said it wasn't Henry, it was Gordon. Daddy said it was Henry. I said it wasn't. It is, it isn't, it is, it isn't. I went to Mummy, and then Mummy intervened. It is Henry, she said. But I said it couldn't because only Gordon has square buffers and 2 windows in his cab. I can't read yet. I don't believe either of them. And I'm writing to to you to tell them that they're both wrong.
By 1952, I had developed a stock answer to this question. The engine really is Henry. Even though he has square buffers and two side windows in his cab, this is what happened. In the 3 railway engines, when he first came, Henry was naughty and wouldn't come out of the tunnel into the rain. So the Fat Controller said he must stay there till he was a good engine again. When he came out and helped to pull the express, the Fat Controller was pleased with him and gave him a new coat of blue paint with red stripes. But tunnels are damp and dirty places. His buffers and his cab had got rusty, and soon afterwards had to be mended at the works. "Who does Henry think he is?" said the works foreman. "We can't afford to keep special buffers and cabs for him. He'll have to make do with spare parts we've got for Gordon." So Henry came out of the works looking like Gordon. He was pleased, but Gordon was cross, especially when people like you mixed them up. Gordon was so rude to poor Henry that Henry got quite ill. He only got better when the Fat Controller had painted him green again and gave him round buffers. But he never felt really well till he was given special coal. So that is why Henry looks like Gordon in the picture. To do Dalby justice, he had not really been responsible for the great Henry Gordon mix-up. The damage had been done by the fact that the first, and fortunately nameless artist of the first edition of the 3 railway engines Middleton. As mentioned above, I had designed Edward, Gordon, and Henry, each with distinctive shapes and wheel arrangements, so that they could be easily told apart. But this man either through ignorance or sheer muddle-headedness, had given Henry the same 462 wheel arrangement as Gordon. When, therefore, Henry was, on the last page of 3 railway engines, given the same blue livery as Gordon, there was going to be little difference between the two. I was furious about this, and my first reaction was to abolish Henry. To this end, I gave him only one mention in Thomas the Tank Engine, and that as an invalid. I hoped that this would give the Facts Director, as he was then, a good excuse for scrapping him. I ignored Henry entirely in James the Red Engine, but I had reckoned without my readers. I had so many enquiries after Henry's health that I had to give him a reprieve, and he appeared, still in blue and still in a delicate state of health, in Tank Engine Thomas again. But after the furore that picture, page 9 of Tank Engine Thomas again, caused, I had only one choice. Henry must be reinstated and given a green livery again. This was done in troublesome engines, and I hoped too that by giving the engines numbers, Gordon and Henry could be more easily distinguished. But it didn't work that way. Even then I had letters still mixing them up, and even asking why Gordon was now green instead of his former blue. The Henry problem was growing with every book. It was time to be ruthless. If I couldn't scrap Henry, he must have a severe accident, which would necessitate his complete rebuilding. That'll do it. This is what happened in Henry the Green Engine. Henry returned home with a new and unmistakable shape. The operation was entirely successful. Henry became a reformed character and has since been no trouble. Even Dalby couldn't muddle him up with any of the others. There were, of course, other mistakes, which could not be easily explained away. For instance, in Gordon the Big Engine, page 51 shows Gordon, Henry, James and Edward together in a shed. But there are two mistakes. An obvious one. The central pillar of the shed, which supports the roof, is shown in front of Henry's left buffer. Thus, if Henry tries to emerge forward, he will knock away the pillar and bring down the roof. B is not so obvious, but all the same, it was pointed out to me by a boy of 5. James is shown with a 4-wheel leading bogey, and thus a 460, while in the pictures in the same book, he's a 260. I must share some of the blame for this, however, for not noticing the mistake myself in the first place. Other mistakes, hard or impossible to explain away, arose from inconsistency in the depiction of stations, buildings, line-side features, and background scenery generally. Young readers did not bombard me so heavily with questions about these, for they were more interested in engines than scenery. But I did get some. Too many, in fact, for differences in the depiction of scenery at particular places are impossible to explain away, particularly as sometimes happened, they occurred in the same book. Protests to Mr. Dolby were unavailing. They often got the answer, "What does it matter anyway? I can't abide uniformity. Besides, it's made a good picture." I had, therefore, in self-defense, to devise some other way of dealing with the problem. And the germ of an idea became with the 4th story in Tank Engine Thomas again. It was my custom, as each story or part of it was written, to try it out on my children. If they laughed in the right places, well and good. If they showed signs of disappointment, I would have to try again. This particular story tells of a race between Thomas and a bus named Bertie over the whole length of Thomas's branch, from Knapford to Farquhar. I had worked out the whole story, giving each the same number of hazards. I had written the first 2 pages which described their argument at Knapford Junction, and how they decided to settle it by having a race. When they started, Thomas, to the consternation of his 2 coaches, did not accelerate as much as Bertie. Thomas was taking his time. He had remembered the level crossing. The payoff was that on the payoff line on that page was, "There was Bertie fuming at the gates, while Thomas sailed gaily through." As one child, my 3 children protested, "Daddy, that's not fair!" So, to show them that things really were fair, I fetched the sketch map of the branch I had drawn while working out the story. And to help them understand, I drew little pictures of the various things each would have to face. Traffic lights, level crossings, detours, etc. for Bertie, adverse signals, stations, trains coming the other way, etc. for Thomas. We coloured the map with crayons, putting in Thomas and Bertie, and roads and rivers and hills and valleys. We counted up the hazards and found that not only each had the same number, but that the real race only began after the last town, Elsbridge, had been passed, when road and rail ran side by side up the valley on equal terms. I have that sketch map still. I made another copy, complete with geographical features, and sent it to Mr. Dolby with my pictures, and he used it, to a certain extent, for his pictures of the branch line in that book. This encouraged me to hope that if I could find a location for the Fat Controller's Railway and map it, we could, so to speak, standardise the scenery at any given spot, and so avoid the scenic questions which had already begun to come in, and which were almost impossible to answer. The great question was, where? The answer came as a spin-off from a preaching engagement I had been invited to preach at a Sunday school festival in the Isle of Man. I had never been there before, and soon discovered that though the bishop's title is that of Sodor and Man, he has only the Isle of Man for his diocese. There are historic reasons for this, but as we have to go back some 700 years to find when and why Sodor was lost, we decided to ignore them and do a kindness to the poor deprived bishop by discovering the other half of his diocese for him. This is the island of Sodor, fictional, which lies between Barrow-in-Furness and the Isle of Man. Real. This is also served by the Fat Controller's Railway. the Little Railway, the Mountain Railway, and the Small Railway, but most of these were in the future at that time in 1950 to 51. Mr. Ward took a deal of persuading, but eventually not only gave the project his blessing, but also had a large-scale relief map of the island made, which has hung ever since on the wall of my various studies. And it now hangs in the Awdry study in the Narrow Gauge Railway Museum, for the 3 or 4 of you who might not have noticed that already. The localising of the Fat Controllers Railway in the island of Sodor had a profound effect on the Thomas books and the disciplines under which they were, in future, written. The first stories, those in the 3 railway engines for example, were told